What's up, witches? Do you see what I did there? Because we're talking about witches today. I'm very clever. This is the final installment of the special Halloween true crime series for the month of October. And you might not think of witches as part of like a true crime channel, but witchcraft all by itself used to be criminal. It was illegal to practice. And if people thought you were, you could die for that discretion. If you've been here before, thanks for coming back. And if you're new, hi, my name's Rachel, and I'm here to bring you true crime and true crime adjacent videos. If you haven't already, but you've been meaning to, don't forget to hit the little button at the bottom to subscribe to the channel and join me here whenever I post. Oh, also, forgot to mention, there was a theme for this month and you were supposed to guess the theme. Right now would be the time to go to the comments and put in your guesses if you've seen the other two videos that I uploaded this month. You can probably get it though. It's not that clever. Normally now would be the time that I would roll the disclaimer and we would get started with the story. But for this one, there's no disclaimer necessary. So I chose this story to be the last of the season because I don't think that anything really evokes the spirit of All Hallows Eve quite like the practice of witchcraft. By design, it bridges our world with the world of the supernatural, which is what Halloween is all about. Societies across the globe have believed in the existence of witches in one form or another. They don't always use that word, but most cultures believe that certain people have special spiritual abilities to work magic through herbology, incantations, or communing with spirits. And every culture and society has its own particular rites and rituals and lore associated with the practice of witchcraft. But in England and in the US, we have a very unique and special history with witches. And that history is, in a lot of ways, still shrouded in mystery, relegated to the realm of legend, and haunted by a past of ignorance, superstition, and religious persecution. Today's story is about a particular woman named Jane Wenham, who was the last person given the death penalty for being a witch in England. And I wanted to talk about this story because I feel like, and this might be my bias as an American, but I feel like we hear a lot about like the Salem witch trials, and that is a big topic of discussion. But I don't tend to hear as much about the English counterparts to that. And I thought it was very interesting. So that's what we're doing today. Now, many people think of witch hunts and witch trials as this sort of long-standing, widespread occurrence that really defined an era. And I absolutely was one of those people. I think about like pilgrims with their funny hats and buckle shoes, Puritans basically. And I imagine that for like 100 years in England and the Americas, there was like a systemic elimination of witches that was very pervasive, I guess. And I imagined that all of these completely erroneous executions were met out by a ignorant and theocratic justice system. But as it turns out, I might have spent a little bit too much time watching Hocus Pocus and not enough time reading my history books, as if my rural Indiana high school had like a section about witchcraft in their history books. Obviously not, but you know what I'm trying to say. That perception that I had and that I think a lot of people have isn't really wholly accurate. In actuality, witch hunts and witch trials and witch executions in the Americas were kind of rare and actually kind of isolated to certain communities. By the time this like witch hysteria was picking up in the colonies, it had all but burned out in Europe. I'm sorry I said burned out. That was very insensitive of me since most of them were burned at the stake. My bad. So the Catholic Church had really done quite a number in Europe. Between the years 1500 and 1660, they were responsible for the murder of about 80,000 suspected witches. But what most people don't know, what I didn't know, is that the country that had the highest number of witch executions was not England, it was Germany. And I don't know, Germany's just not a place that like comes to mind when I think about witches. The place I think about the most, as I mentioned before, is Salem, Massachusetts, certainly in the top most well-known places where witch trials took place. And you all know the story, neighbor turning against neighbor, people being hung and burned at the stake as witches. It was a fiasco. But as it turns out, only 18 people, 6 men and 12 women or female children, were actually sent to the gallows. And that was all just in 1 year. 1692. There had been a previous rash of witch trials in Windsor, Connecticut, just a couple decades before, around 1645. In the year 1647, Alcee Young became the first person in the colonies to be executed as a witch. By the time Connecticut completely stopped prosecuting witches in 1697, a total of 11 people had been killed for the crime. In Virginia, they passed a law in 1655 which made it illegal to falsely accuse someone of witchcraft, which was a big deal because even then they realized that most of the people claiming and accusing that their neighbors were witches were doing so over like small personal grievances or for political gain. Even still, Virginia did end up having about 24 witch trials, of which the number of people executed was 0. They never sentenced anyone to death for being a witch. Now, of course, all of these stats are about actual, real, like legal proceedings. I'm sure there was a lot of vigilante justice going on, a bunch of pitchfork waving peasants hunting down the old widow that lives alone and like makes weird tea. I'm sure that there was some of that going on. But at least here in the Americas, the problem wasn't nearly as systemic as popular culture makes it seem. And we were very late, very, very late to the game. By the late 1600s, most people no longer believed in the existence of witches as mistresses of the devil. They didn't think that there were just women out there trying to cause harm by consorting with evil spirits. And as people became more educated and more enlightened, and the Catholic Church kind of backed off their BS, nothing against Catholicism, of course, I'm just saying that in the Middle Ages, they were maybe doing a little too much. We were coming out of medieval times and into the Renaissance. And the people most commonly thought of as like, ooh, suspected witch were now more often being seen for what they were. Elderly women, widows, midwives, traditional healers, and herbalists, at least for the most part. Of course, you're always going to have a group of individual yokels, let's say, who are not going to stop shouting about how the earth is flat, despite all evidence to the contrary. And there's always somebody in a position of power ready to whip those yokels up into a frenzy and use them for their own aspirations. By the early 1700s, that's pretty much where we were with witchcraft, a split between educated and uneducated people as to whether or not they even believed that this sort of thing existed. And now that you've had your absurdly short history lesson, we are going to embark on an adventure to Walkern, Hertfordshire, England, in the year 1712. The day was New Year's Day, and a young man named Matthew Gilson, who was a servant of local farmer John Chapman, was out performing some chores on the farm for his master. As he carried some straw around the barn, he was approached by an old woman who was wearing, as he describes, either a riding cloak or some kind of hood. The woman asked if she could buy a penny's worth of hay from Matthew, but he refused. After all, it was not his hay to sell anyway. It belonged to his employer. Matthew would later state that he heard the woman say that she would then take it, which he took to mean she was going to steal the straw. Matthew also claimed that as the old woman turned to leave, he heard her muttering something under her breath. And when she did that, he felt an uncontrollable compulsion to leave his work and run 3 miles to a neighboring farm to ask for some hay. When he was denied hay at that farm, he ran and went to some kind of dung heap, which I assume is where they've mucked all the horse poop out of the barn, and he started taking straw from there. In order to carry it home, he was putting it in his shirt, like he took off his shirt and filled it with the dirty straw. And in a time and place where you did not probably wash your clothes that often, and a servant probably only had one set of clothes to begin with, this was probably not a great idea. During his excursion, Matthew claims that at no point did he have control over himself. He was moving completely not of his own free will. And as he recounted this tale to his employer, John Chapman, John saw an opportunity to rid himself of a problem that he had had for quite a little while. Chapman had for years believed that an old widow who lived nearby named Jane Wenham was responsible for the deaths of numerous horses and cattle on his farm through the use of witchcraft. This had caused him to have a personal vendetta against this woman, but it seemed like his grievances generally weren't taken that seriously. Again, like I said, by 1712, for the most part, people were kind of like, yeah, okay, witches, sure. Plus, he had no proof that she had done this. He just suspected her. Probably he just didn't like her for some reason. But now, of course, he had a rather convenient eyewitness to her magical powers. Matthew was literally his servant. I feel like it would have been pretty easy to put him up to kind of falsifying this tale. But regardless, Chapman used this opportunity to finally confront Jane, and he called her, quote, a witch and a bitch. At this time, being called a bitch was probably worse than being accused of being a witch. And 70-year-old Jane was having absolutely none of it. She did not live through 3/4 of a century, through God knows what, just to be called names by some grumpy butthole. She was already widowed, and she was living in poverty. Her reputation was all she really had, and she did not want it besmirched. So on February 9th, Jane went to the local magistrate to make a complaint of slander against John Chapman. She was pretty livid, and she told the magistrate that not only did John owe her compensation for this insult, but she wanted it to be enough that it would discourage anyone else in town from levying the same accusations against her. And that's probably because she was 70 years old and she had seen this kind of thing happen before. One person says you're a witch. Now all of a sudden everybody in town is coming up with stories about how you're a witch. She really wanted to just nip it in the bud. The problem, of course, is that for an insult to be slander, it has to be untrue. So Sir Henry Chauncey, the magistrate in question, took some time to sort of ask around about Jane, how she was, just kind of get a feel for her character. And unfortunately for Jane, most people thought she was kind of a bitch. It seems that most of the town folk had a fairly low opinion of her. She was sort of grumpy and generally disagreeable, quarrelsome, I guess a bit rude, just not very neighborly. This, of course, didn't prove that she was a witch, but as for the other charge, Chauncey just wasn't sure that slander had actually taken place. But he didn't really want to get his hands dirty with it. Indecisive guy, I guess. And he felt like this issue was going to be better handled by their local minister, Reverend Gardner. Now, Reverend Gardner seems to have acted as sort of a moderator between Chapman and Jane, encouraging them to just kind of like, can't we all just get along kind of thing. Live peaceably together and just stop fighting, stop quarreling with each other, you know? He did, though, tell John that he needed to pay Jane a shilling for the trouble, which even then, not a huge sum of money, more than it is now. Obviously, it's like 1 cent. And I don't know this for sure, but I suspect that the Reverend knew that Jane was impoverished. Maybe she was doing this in order to get a little bit of money that she desperately needed. So he had hoped that John could pay the shilling and they could just live in harmony, hold hands, sing kumbaya. But living peaceably is not at all what Jane had in mind. This tiny sum that she had received was not nearly enough in her mind to make John Chapman pay for what he had done. And she declared to Reverend Gardner, "If I can't have justice here, I shall have it elsewhere." And then she stormed out the door. I understand where she's coming from, but she's definitely coming off like ye olde Karen over here, don't you think? Anyway, as she was leaving, another clergyman named Francis Bragg was coming to see Gardner, and supposedly the two of them then witnessed proof of Jane's evil powers. Within an hour of Jane Wenham storming out, both men heard some kind of commotion happening in the kitchen. They both ran to the kitchen, and there they saw Gardner's maidservant, a young woman named Anne Thorne, and she was absolutely hysterical. She had most of her clothes off. It says she was stripped to her shirt sleeves, and this is an old-timey garment, but I think that means that she was just basically in her underclothing without all of the outer stuff on it. Correct me if I'm wrong and you're a clothing historian. Anyway, she had some of her clothes off and she was wringing her hands hysterically and just screaming. In the middle of her fit, she's like pointing downward towards her feet, but she's not speaking. And as the men inspect what she's pointing at, they see sort of a bundle of twigs or sticks at her feet. When they look at it more closely, they see it's actually like sticks and leaves that are kind of tied up in the bottom of her skirts and her apron. Once she did find her voice, 17-year-old Anne Thorne told this absolutely fantastical story about being overcome with a compulsion to run away from the house. She said that for no reason at all, her thoughts suddenly turned to Jane Wenham, and she just had to run and go. So she took off down the road. She didn't know exactly where she was headed. It seems that she picked up these twigs and leaves herself along the way, and she ended up meeting up with Jane and speaking to her and then making her way back to the house, which is where Gardner and Bragg found her. Again, just like Matthew the servant, she described having no free will, being moved without any kind of control. Clearly, she had been bewitched by the old woman. The two clergymen were right away a little bit suspicious of the girl's story, mostly because her time was off a little bit. They knew when they had last seen her. That would have only left her about 7 minutes to make this trip, which based on the distance she traveled would have meant that she was running at about 8 miles an hour. Is it possible? Technically? Is it likely? No, especially because this young woman had recently sustained a pretty serious knee injury. However, in Anne's favor, someone had just so happened to witness the entire event and came forward to corroborate her story. And would you like to take a guess who this very incredibly credible eyewitness was? You are correct. It is the farmer, John Chapman, the very man who had the issue with Jane Wenham in the first place. And he wanted nothing more than to prove that Jane was a witch who had been killing his livestock. Now, so far, apparently, Jane's only power is to make people run fast, which, quite frankly, sounds like a pretty lame witch to me, but I digress. Anyway, this is all becoming quite the drama around town, and Jane heard of Anne's accusations. Now, all of her fears were coming true. Chapman had indeed accused her, not really been punished for it, and now other people were coming forward to accuse her of the same thing. The old woman was understandably very irate about this, and if I had to venture a guess, I would imagine that she was maybe a little scared too. Even though, again, we were moving away from this sort of superstitious thinking, witchcraft was still a crime, and it was a crime that you could still be killed for. It is possible, although we don't know, that in her 70 or so years, Jane had witnessed this happen, perhaps to other women in her town. And I don't know for sure, but if I were in her shoes, I'd be a little frightened. Unfortunately, what Jane did was something that probably caused more harm than good. She approached Anne and angrily asked her why she had lied. She then threatened the girl, saying, "If you tell any more stories of me, it shall be worse for you than it has been yet." And then Jane pushed her, like shoved her. "Jane, girl, what are you doing? What are you doing? This is some very witch-like behavior from somebody who's not a witch. You need to stop. You're going to get yourself in trouble." Anyway, of course, as soon as Jane made contact with Anne, Anne started convulsing and screaming and really just putting on the whole "I've been bewitched" show. She started wandering around, crazily collecting sticks and mud clots. She wandered into the river and acted like she was going to drown herself in it. She also apparently became very violent, acting towards Jane, expressing a desire to, quote, "draw the witch's blood." Now my question is this: I'm a witch, right? I'm going to bewitch somebody so that they do my bidding. Why would I bewitch them to be violent towards me? Why would I put a spell on them that made them homicidal towards me? That doesn't make any sense at all. None. Now keep in mind, all of this stuff is happening pretty quickly. From the time that Jane made her slander complaint against Chapman, it would only take 4 days for things to escalate to this point and for Jane to be arrested on February 13th, 1712, for, of course, the crime of witchcraft. An additional minister was brought in, Reverend Strutt, and he put Jane to a test, asking her to recite the Lord's Prayer from memory. She made an attempt, but she misspoke just one word, and that was enough to convince Strutt and Reverend Gardner that she was, in fact, guilty. And by February 16th, they were taking her full confession. She admitted that she had indeed bewitched Anne Thorne. She said that she had made a pact with the devil some 16 years before, when he had come to her in the form of a cat. The trial began on March 4th. Very predictably, Jane's neighbors came out to go ahead and send out some more accusations for myriad troubles they were having, including the deaths of many cattle and some other livestock, and also implicated her in the deaths of 2 infant children. Now, this is 1712. It's in the country. 7 out of every 10 babies died before their first birthday anyway. So I don't know how they knew the difference between the ones that were bewitched and the ones that just died. But they definitely blamed the deaths of these babies on Jane. Some of the townspeople even complained that they were being visited at night by noisy cats. Probably not at all driven by all of the mice and rats that would have been drawn to the grain in the agricultural area, right? No, definitely Jane was sending the cats. And one person even claimed that they saw a cat that had Jane's very own face. Of course, young Anne Thorne's affliction was brought to the forefront, with supposed witnesses claiming that she continued to have convulsions, to show up with strange wounds and bruises, and that strange cakes of feathers, in quotes, had been found in the girl's pillows. So the judge in this case, Sir John Powell, was not really on board with the whole witch thing. He sort of wryly told accusers that he wished he could see some of these enchanted feathers and wondered why no one had thought to preserve some of these bewitched cakes. Because, it kind of seems like you would. Seems like if you had some magic feather cakes in your pillows and you were accusing somebody of witchcraft, that you would save them to bring in as evidence, but somehow nobody had done that. Powell is really just kind of laughing at them to himself. He really knew that this was a trial of appeasing the unsophisticated townies. Again, I will reiterate that by this time, educated people did not believe in witchcraft. It was very much a split between the educated, the elite, people who no longer believed in superstition, and people who were really sort of thought of as ignorant, filthy peasants. In England in 1712, they were not in the Dark Ages, okay? They had scientists, they had doctors. It was rudimentary compared to what we have now, but there just wasn't a lot of witch burning going on. Sir John Powell knew that Jane Wenham was no more a witch than he was. But of course, he still had to do his job and oversee the case. And the jury was not quite as enlightened as Justice Powell. It took them less than 2 hours to come back with a guilty verdict and to sentence Jane to death. And so Jane Wenham became the last person ever sentenced to death in England for the crime of witchcraft. But would you like to hear something fun? She did not die. Justice Powell immediately overturned her death sentence and eventually was even able to get a royal pardon for her. And that being said, Mrs. Wenham could not very well just return to her home in Walkern, right? It's a very awkward situation to be walking about town, running into people who think you're a witch and wanted you to die. But of course, she was elderly. She couldn't work. She was living in poverty. She didn't really have anywhere to go. She needed somebody kind of to take care of her. Luckily, a guy named Captain John Plummer took her in, and she lived with him for quite a few years until he passed. She actually outlived him. She was already pretty old. Maybe she was a witch. He passed in 1720, and when he did so, she ended up being taken in by William Cowper, the first Earl of Cowper, which might seem weird for this random old lady from the country to go and live with an earl. But this case had been so highly publicized and really gave a chance for the educated elite to kind of point and laugh at the stupid yokels. So William Cowper taking her in would certainly have been kind of a way of him saying, see, stupid idiots, you don't need to be afraid of this old lady. She's not a witch. Look, she's living in my house. Everything is copacetic. And Jane ended up living with Cowper for the next 10 years until she finally died at the age of 90. I think the average life expectancy at this time was like 37. So she had a good one. She had a good long life. Good for her. After this time, there were little pockets of resurgence of witch trials and witch hunts, but Jane's case was the end of death sentences for witches in England. And as they continued to press on into the age of enlightenment, more and more people began to rely on science and reason over superstition. But there were some people who had a hard time letting it go. The king actually got a little paranoid and in 1735 passed the Witch Act, which stayed on the books for way too freaking long. In fact, the last person to be imprisoned under the Witch Act of 1735 was a woman who claimed to be a medium. Her name was Helen Duncan, and she was tried for witchcraft in 1933. So like I said, you can lead a horse to evidence-based scientific reason, but you can't make them drink. It's still that way now. But that is all I have for you today about the story of Jane Wenham, the last witch of England. I hope that you enjoyed this and that you learned something. I know I did while I was researching this. As always, please take some time to take care of yourself today and every day. Subscribe if you want to. Like this video if you liked it. And I will see you on the next one. Goodbye.